Chapter 25 in the Hall of General Crack. Meanwhile, in the city of Torborough, Commander Norm was just arriving at the palace tour after traveling through the night and most of the day. By the reckoning of the old maps, Torborough was a 2-day journey from Glipwood by the main road, but the Fangs stopped for neither rest nor food as they drove their horses mercilessly across the barren prairies to the city. The city of Torborough sprawled on the south bank of the river Blap and bustled with activity. No one who lived there seemed to know where anyone else was going or why, and many had very little notion as to where they themselves were going at any given moment. People were walking, pushing carts, driving carriages, leading sheep, carrying sacks of potatoes, loading wagons with fish, selling, buying, yelling, talking, all without smiling or thinking about much at all. Lurking among the people were armored fangs of varying sizes and shapes. Lurking among the fangs were trolls, and a single troll stunk worse than 100 fangs. If a troll brushed against some unfortunate passerby, the poor fellow would stink up his home for weeks. So wherever the trolls went, the people scattered like wind-blown leaves. The citizens of Torborough could scarcely remember the days before the war, when fangs and trolls were only rumors from across the dark sea of darkness. Now the sight of monsters walking among them seemed as normal as the seagulls that swooped and chattered in the air above the city. Commander Norm started to open the carriage door, but stopped when he saw the jewels glittering on his fat arms and fingers. He hastily removed the bracelets and rings and placed them in his pouch, relieved that he had remembered to conceal them. He didn't want any fights over his newly acquired shinies. Norm squeezed himself out of the carriage with a long grunt and picked at the pieces of flabbit stuck between his teeth. He had been snacking on the drive. The exhausted horses wheezed and staggered while the plump commander climbed the long stairway to the mouth-like entrance of the palace tour. So the palace tour was built by Thorn the Tor, who was the warrior king who built the palace at the beginning of the Third Epoch, and he was fond of kittens. On every spire of the palace tower were statues of kittens in varied posture. From a bluff on the north bank of the Blap, it was plain that the palace itself was built to resemble a happy, crouching kitty. The uppermost spire was the tail, the portcullis resembled the teeth, and the drawbridge was undeniably tongue-like. For ages, the Tor dynasty nursed a disturbing fondness for all things kitten. Then came the Great War, when Fangs captured King Alaman Tor, forced him to watch as the kitten statues were pulled down and shattered one by one. When all the kitties in the kingdom were placed on a raft and set adrift on the river Blap, Alaman the Tor dropped dead with grief. To the citizens of Torborough, however, it was the one good thing the Fangs ever did. Back to the story. The once beautiful castle stood tall and sharp against the gray sky, the windows of its spires black, and its banners tattered and swaying limply in the thick air as if in mourning for their former glory. The two troll guards stood watch at the main door, looking down at Norm and the driver. "What business have you with the general?" one of them said in a booming voice that rattled Norm's armor. "The same I had last time, and the time before that, and the time before that, horse maggot," Norm scowled. The troll burped and moved aside, motioning with the other troll to open the great wooden door. "Oafs," Norm hissed as he passed over the threshold and into the palace. The main hall was littered with bones and garbage. The stench would have made a human sick, but to Norm it smelled like dinner. The Fangs lounged here and there, sleeping on the floor or leaning against the walls. Trolls huddled over a dice game in the corner. Some of them looked up when Norm entered, then turned back to their business. Norm looked around for a moment, smiling. "Oh, it's good to be back in the thick of it," he thought. He lumbered down the center of the hall to the Fang sentries posted outside the throne room. "Greetings, Commander Norm," one of the Fangs said, lifting his spear so that he could pass. "Blia," replied Norm, and he entered the throne room of the most powerful Fang in all of the Scree. Unlike the main hall, the throne room was empty but for General Crack and a Fang servant who was filling his goblet with a black sludge. Norm bowed so low his scaly gut almost touched the floor, and for a long time he waited. He knew that many commanders had lost their heads by rising without permission. Finally, he heard the general grunt, and Norm rose from his bow with a great deal of difficulty. "Norm," Crack said, his voice echoing in the empty hall. He sipped from his goblet. The ceiling was high, and the pale light streamed in through narrow windows. The room was bare of furniture, but for the gilded throne, now covered with filth. The general was one of the Nag the Nameless's oldest servants. It was Crack who led the army that destroyed Anira, and Crack who had sailed the Fang horde across the dark sea to Scree. It was Crack whose orders sent the black carriage roving across the land to kidnap Scree and children, and he whom even the Fangs feared. His torso and abdomen were long and lithe, and though his arms and legs were shorter and thinner than that of most Fangs, no other was a match for Crack's prowess. His teeth were longer and sharper than Norm's, and it was said that his venom could kill a sea dragon. "What news do you bring from Glibwood?" the general asked. "No news, Lord. A scuffle in the day with sea dragons came, but it was quickly resolved." Norm absently scratched his belly. Usually the meetings with General Crack were short, and he was hungry for some of Dugtown's famous fish entrails at a tavern called the Gargle and Slurp. The city of Dugtown crouched on the north bank of the River Blap, and was Torborough's grubby neighbor, a maze of decrepit buildings crawling with thieves and beggars. Norm hated having to travel so far for such a short conversation, but at least he was able to slink over to Dugtown for a few days. "Come nearer, Commander Norm. I have news from the castle, Throg." Norm moved closer, hoping the general wouldn't take too much time. He pictured in his mind the gloriously filthy lower streets of Dugtown, where he would soon be gobbling little squirmies over a game of dice. "The Nameless has sent word," said Crack, savoring the news, "that he is mustering another army. He says it will be a greater army than any Airweir has ever known." Crack paused and let the announcements hang in the air. "And what does our lord plan to do with this great army, sir?" "The Nameless One has kept his purposes hidden from me, but I believe he plans to march west into the unknown lands. As you know, he still seeks the jewels of Anira. He no longer believes them to be in Scree, but beyond it, beyond the edges of all the maps." "Sir, why does the Nameless One seek the jewels?" Norm bowed slightly. "If I am permitted to ask, sir." The general's tail curled up and around the armrest of the throne. He toyed with the end of it while he spoke. A fat yellow centipede squirmed from the sludge in a desperate attempt to escape the goblet, but Crack's tongue whipped out and snapped the creature into his mouth. The Fang closed his eyes and swallowed carefully. "When we sacked Anira." He said the word as if it tasted vile in his mouth. "Many writings of King Wingfeather were found. In them, he spoke of the jewels of Anira and the ancient power they hold, a power that could destroy the Nameless One and restore Anira to its glory." Norm had figured as much. For years, Nag had been consumed with finding the jewels, though Norm had often wondered how they would ever locate something that could be hidden so easily. Besides, what power could possibly overcome the mighty Nag and his army? "He believes the jewels are hidden beyond the maps?" Norm asked, though he was quickly losing interest. Every moment he spent there was a moment he wasn't spending in the Gargle and Slurp, dining on Torkney brains. "He has sought them in Scree all these years," said Crack, "and he grows impatient. The Screans have no knowledge of what lies west of the plains, but if there are peoples there to conquer, I'm sure he means to do it. It is not our job to know what our master's great mind intends." He said it with a wave of his hand. Crack leaned forward. "But he does require something of you, Commander Norm." "Anything, my lord," replied Norm with a slight bow. He could taste the rat tails, feel them slipping deliciously down his throat. "The Nameless One needs more prisoners sent to Dang. I'm ordering the commanders of all the sectors of Scree to double their arrests. Not just the children anymore, but whole families. We will fill the black carriage with screens and send them by the shipload to our lord Nag, who has no name. Crack took another long sip of the sludge and smiled. I trust you will find this enjoyable. Oh, yes, Lord, very enjoyable. Norm smirked, thinking of which glipfolk he would seize first. Then he thought again of the taverns of Dugtown and asked, Will that be all, General? Crack caressed his tail and glared at Norm. Yes, Commander, go. Norm again bowed low, and as he did, a gold medallion on a silver chain slipped from where he had tucked it into his breastplate. The necklace glinted in the light and dangled from his neck alluringly. Wait, the general said, slithering out of the throne and down the steps. The click of his claws on the marble floor echoed throughout the chamber. And where did you acquire this trinket? Norm felt clammy sweat seep from between his scales. He dared not move. From one of the townspeople, Lord. A woman. It is yours, if you please, he stammered. The general snatched the medallion from Norm's neck with a hiss and snaked his way back onto the throne with a grunt of dismissal. He eyed the medallion with satisfaction. I like the way it sparkles, the general said to himself as he slipped it on. Now go. Norm rose and exited the throne room. He stormed back through the hall where the trolls and fangs continued to lounge and heaved himself back onto his carriage. Take me to Dugtown, he growled. Now! The driver scurried onto the carriage and drove the disgruntled commander down the cobbled streets to the ferry to Dugtown, where he would feast on guts and drown his anger at losing his favorite bit of loot.